Okay, so we're picking up from the study that we started last week, and we're going to be delving into the book of Hebrews for a while. And there's lots to be learned from that. And Hebrews is one of those really challenging books, and I brought that up last week. And part of the reason it's so challenging is it's written to people who were Jews and understood Judaism, and it's speaking to them in the terms that Jews understood. So there's a lot of Jewish detail about things and a lot of terminology that's used. And this week we'll particularly see one evidence of that, that if you don't understand the terminology, you don't understand what's being said. And so Hebrews has always been a challenging book for people. But we started last week by talking a little bit about UFOs, and I'm going to do that a little bit again today. Um, in the context of Hebrews, though, and so in Hebrews, what we were looking at was the first part of Hebrews, the first 4 verses, tells us where Jesus fits into the heavenly order. So he is at the right hand of God, he's above the angels, those sort of things are all of what's covered in that, and part of what we'll be getting back to here. And so in that context, we're going to ask, what are men relative to angels? How are they different from us? What are we like? Because we talked about that idea last week of if there are UFOs and if there are people in them, then that really isn't a problem for your faith. Nothing in the Bible says that they couldn't be there. God could have created them. And we also talked about the possibility that maybe they are Satan's angels, pretending to be people from another planet. So both of those are valid possibilities and shouldn't cause us any problem. And so I just last week wanted to make sure that no one is concerned about this report that's going to be coming out in 1st of June about what the military understands from these things that it has seen. And we've seen videos. In fact, today, or was it yesterday, a new video came out about UFOs. And and so I want to bring up a different point of view than you've probably even thought of. And this is, do Satan's angels have manufacturing like we do to make these ships, if they have these ships? And you've probably never asked yourself that question, but it's a good question to ask because it gives us some understanding into them. And um, and so we that's how we do things. When we build something, we learn about all the things we need to do to build it and make it work, and we do those things. But is it that way for angels, or are they different than us? And one example that I want to look at comes from the book of Job. If you remember that, Job meets with God, and God gives him the authority to destroy all of the things that Job has, but not touch Job at all. And so Satan goes out, and one of the things that happens is, and this is reported in the book, is it says the fire of God fell from the heavens. And in fact, what the fire of God does there is it falls from the heavens and it kills all 7,000 sheep that Job has. Job has a whole lot of sheep and goats and camels and all sorts of things. He's a man with a lot of things. And it also kills all of the people who are tending the sheep, except for one who comes back to report that. So I did a little calculation on that, and I said how much land area would 7,000 sheep need if they were free to roam around, and it would be at least a square mile. So that's a mile on one side and a mile on the other side, square. And so it's a huge area. So this fire from God that fell from the heavens and destroyed this would have left a scorched earth for that size, or even bigger than that size. And so the question comes up is, how does Satan do that? How does Satan command down fire? Does he have to make some sort of a machine that generates this fire and he sends it down? Well, no, the answer isn't like that at all. And that's one of the differences between us and angels. God has authorized us to learn things and to use the things that we have learned. And so back sometime in history, there was a person who noticed that wood floats on water. And he wondered to himself, well, if I put a whole bunch of wood together, would I be able to climb on top of that wood, and would it keep me up from going in the water? And so ultimately that led to the idea of boating and boats that travel across the oceans. And so in the same way, we learn things from what we see from nature mostly, and we learn them just by thinking about things. And now we've built machines to probe into atomic level things. And so we are allowed to learn things. And I do mean allowed. God has authorized us to learn certain things, but there are some things that he doesn't allow us to learn, and he keeps us back on that. And I'm not going to go into any biblical references for this. I just want you to kind of accept this idea that angels are not like us in this way. And so for us, when we make something, we have to learn all of the pieces that need to be done at first. So if you're making a car, you need to learn how to make a radio first, and you need to have radio waves and radio stations, all of that sort of stuff, and all those millions of little pieces that have to be in place for a car to be what a car is. Um, someone isn't muted there. Okay, and so that's the way our life is, and that's the way God has set up life for us. We need to learn first, and then we can build and do things with what we learn. It's not that way for angels, though. Angels have all knowledge, or at least almost all knowledge. From the time they were created, they knew everything that there was to know that God had made knowable. Now you remember that Jesus, in fact, himself said there were some things that God hadn't told him. And so he didn't know those either. And so God holds back certain things. But for the most part, angels have all knowledge and all understanding of life, the universe, and everything. And they don't have to learn things like we do. And that makes a big difference in how they would attack the problem of making something. They create ex nihilo is the word for it. That's a biblical term. It also describes the way God creates, and it means from nothing. And so angels also create from nothing. They do it by faith as God authorizes them. So they are also limited in what they can do. God won't allow them to do anything, to build anything that he doesn't want them to. And we see that in the book of Job as well. Book of Job is quite an interesting book that way. It's a story about a man who suffers a lot, but there's a lot more things in that. There's second coming references, and there's references to life after death, and also this part about Satan meeting with God and God authorizing him to do these things. And so it has a lot of insight into other areas. And so what we see in the book of Job is that God authorizes him to do this. And so now with this authority, he is allowed to use the power of God that way. And so it's actually quite similar to us in when God allows us to do things through faith. We see that more in the Bible. So for example, Peter, a lot of people were being healed by Peter. And so, of course, that wasn't Peter doing the healing. That's God doing the healing, using his power. And Peter doesn't know what's wrong with the person who's being healed. It's just God knows what they need, and he does what needs to be done to heal them. And so Peter is different from the angels in that way. The angels know exactly what would need to be done to heal somebody, but they need God's authority to do that. We don't have that understanding, and so God fills that in and does that part for us. We just pray for someone to be healed, or if we have the authority from God to do that as a work, then we can do that. So it's very different for angels. That's our experience there. They know in advance every detail of what they are creating if they're going to create something, and they don't need to learn how to operate it if they built it. So if they decided to build a radio, they wouldn't need to learn how to tune it or do anything like that. They would have created it from their knowledge, and it would work according to how they had decided to create it. So you've probably never thought of these kind of ideas before. So when it comes down to building something like a spaceship, if that's what they've done, and it would be because God allowed it to happen, and they don't have a manufacturing facility for it. They just will it into existence, and because God has authorized them to do that, that happens. So maybe some interesting insights there. So moving on, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that. So where we were last week, the four verses that begin chapter 1 of Hebrews make a whole bunch of statements about who Jesus is and where he fits in. And we learned last week that he fits in. He's second in command to God. He is above the angels and not like the angels. And those four verses make that statement about that. And when we stopped last week, the author of Hebrews, and we said the author of Hebrews isn't really known. There's a lot of speculation about who he is, but we don't know. But in any case, the author, whoever he is, when we stopped, was supporting all of those things he had said in the first four verses with references mostly from the Old Testament verses. And he brings up those verses and says, here, you can see that here, and you can see that here. And that's an important thing for us to learn and understand too. We should be supporting those claims that we make about things from the Bible and have at least some biblical basis from that. Now, a couple weeks ago, Chance brought up something. There was a person, I think it was a person he worked with, who said that LGBT was acceptable to God because he had found this verse in the Bible that he interpreted in a particular way, and that made him think that God was acceptable with LGBT. And what he did there was he took one verse that wasn't all that clear, and he was able to kind of twist that verse around a little bit so it would mean what he wanted it to mean. And that's not what you see with this author here. You're going to see, well, you've already seen last week, is that I think there were 5 or 6 verse references that he was pulling in there to show his point. And you're going to see him continue on with that theme. He's going to keep pulling out verses from the Old Testament mostly about that support everything that he said. And that should be our goal too. Whether we're trying to explain something to somebody from the Bible or whether it's just for our own understanding. If we want to ask whether society is doing something right or wrong, hopefully we have enough understanding of the Bible that we can go into it and dig out those verses. Maybe the Holy Spirit will help us bring those to memory and we can dig them up and study them. And by getting as many verses as we can, we have a much better chance of getting a complete understanding of that. Because the Bible isn't written like a rule book. It's a book that you need to kind of put everything together, and some of the pieces you need are scattered throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. And you need all of that to fully understand a lot of topics. And so that, keep that in mind whenever you're doing anything with the Bible, is don't ever rely on just one verse. Try to find as many verses as you can on that topic and understand the whole thing from that, just as the author of Hebrews is doing here for us. So back to a regularly scheduled Bible study. So Hebrews chapter 1 verse 7 is where we're picking up here, and he's still doing that. He had started by giving those first 4 verses that made a bunch of big statements about who Jesus was, and now he's backing up those things with Old Testament verses. And so the question that he's answering here is, why should the Hebrews believe what he said in those first 4 verses? And that's what he's doing here, is he's bringing up these things. So Hebrews chapter 1 verse 7 says, "But he spoke in this way about the angels. He makes his angels the wind and his ministers the fire." And that's a quote again. This one's from Psalm 104:4. And this is talking about how God uses angels to do things for him. So they are servants to him. They are not God. They are his servants. And so that's his point there. He says God speaks. In the previous message last week, we saw him speaking about what Jesus would be. He would be the Son. And now he's saying, but he spoke about this way with the angels, and he speaks about them as being servants who do things for him. And that'll continue on as we see here. So chapters 1, verses 8 through 9, he continues on, and he says, so he's just said, this is how God spoke about the angels, and he says, but now concerning the Son, he said, "Your throne, O God, is to the eternity of eternities. A straight scepter is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness, and you have hated evil. Because of this, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of a joy beyond your companions." So this is a quote from Psalm 45, verses 6 through 7, which says, "Your throne, God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of justice." And so that's where he's quoting from here. And I haven't included all of that information here, but you can tell that this is another quote from the Old Testament. And so he's doing that good thing of always bringing up Old Testament support. And these are prophecies from the Old Testament that were talking about what Jesus would be and what he would do and who he was. And so we're seeing that all explained here. And a lot of the basic understanding that we have of Christianity comes from Hebrews, as I said last week. So the ideas that we grew up with in the church, if that's how we came about through them, that were preached from us, we didn't always understand where they were coming from, but a lot of them come from Hebrews, because the book of Hebrews is aimed at Jews who were, as I said last week, who were steeped in Judaism and understood Judaism, but really didn't have a good understanding of Christianity, and in fact, it kind of slipped back a little bit. And so the author of Hebrews is a bit disappointed that he has to go back to the very beginning and teach them all of these things that we're seeing here again about who Jesus is and where he fits in. So, but what we see there is this kingdom that is promised to the Son. And we're going to see that come back again here too. So Hebrews 1:10 through 12 says, "And again, you have laid the foundation of the earth from the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. Those shall pass away, and you remain, and they all shall wear out like a robe, and you shall fold them up like a cloak. They shall be changed, and you are as you are. Your years shall not end." So he's quoting from Psalm 102. I won't even read that because it's pretty much identical. And he's talking about the difference between God and, or the Son and his creator and his creation. His Son, the creator, and his creation. And he says, those things that you've created, the foundation of the earth and the heavens and all those things, those are the work of your hands. And they will pass away, but you will remain. You will not wear out like they do. They will wear out and run down, but you will not be like that. So it's really saying that the Son is going to be a person, a being who is eternal, who does not die, does not wear out, does not run down, and so he's talking more about where Jesus fits in, and really that he is of the same stuff as God, and he says your years shall not end, which really says you can't die, you won't die, and this contradicts, or not actually contradicts, it complements things that Peter says. Peter talks about a time when the heavens and the earth are going to be completely destroyed and rebuilt again, and to make the new heavens and the new earth, and that's referred to in Revelation and other places too. And so that's what's being talked about here is the creation that Jesus made on the instructions of God the Father is something that is going to wear down and run out, and it's going to be destroyed and remade again. And as I said, we know that from other places. Okay, now he's continuing on with this, and he says, but to which of, so he said this to the Son, or said this about the Son in prophecy in the Old Testament. Now he says, but to which of the angels did he ever say, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies as a footstool under your feet? That's a quote from Psalm 110:1, and I won't read that either. But actually, that's an interesting one because Jesus uses that particular verse to show, to ask them a question, to make them think about who he is. And he asks them the question, well, if David is saying this in prophecy, who is the Son, and what is the Son? And the point he's trying to get them to realize is that this prophecy is saying that the Messiah will be God. But the people of that time weren't prepared to accept that idea. They believed that God was singular and not a plurality. And but we know that that's not correct now. And that's what the author of Hebrews is making clear to them as well, is he's saying that Jesus ascended to be with God and now sits at the right hand of God. And God had foretold this back in Psalms through the psalmist David, and that he would be there until a period of time when all of creation would become as a footstool under his feet, which means he's completely in charge of it. Nothing happens that he doesn't want to have happen. And we know that there's going to be a time when the world is changed like that, when there will be no more hate or will be no more hurting, suffering, none of that sort of stuff will happen anymore. And then he closes off this little section here with, behold, are they not all spirits of service, who are sent into service for the sake of those who are going to inherit life? And so he's kind of finishing this little bit off here by saying the purpose of angels is to serve Jesus. And in doing so, they are to be a benefit to those of us who are believers. That's their purpose. And so he's again highlighting that idea that Jesus is not like the angels. He's way above the angels. They worship him, as we saw last week. And he commands them to do the things that he wants, to be the servants who do things. And so that's the difference in them, and that's what's being highlighted with all of these verses, is that Jesus is above all of the angels, and he commands the angels, and they are his servants to do his will. Okay, so a bit of a summary of what we covered last week and this to kind of bring us up to date, and then we'll move forward a little bit. So we saw right at the very first verse that God has always spoken with his people. He's always done that through prophets and angels also. Angels, the word angel means messenger. And so these messengers of God have been sent to us, and in the Old Testament times, the Old Covenant times, maybe I'll say, it was mostly through prophets, sometimes through angels, but God has always had this desire to speak with his people, and he's always been speaking with his people. And he has this big message that he wants to deliver, and it's all about who he is and how he loves us and what he wants from us and how he wants us to be and what he has promised for us. All those sorts of things are part of this big message that he has. And so it's a very big message, and the message has been delivered in parts over time, and it's also been delivered in different forms. It's sometimes been done as a prophecy through a psalmist, sometimes it's been through the law, sometimes it's been through other things. And so God has always been speaking to us, delivering this message about who he is and what he wants from us. So, so God has always been speaking with his people through prophets. But the author of Hebrews says, then God sent the Son as the messenger to us. So his very own Son he sent to be that messenger. And that messenger showed us the glory of God, the wonder of God, and all of those things about the love of God, and so much more. And the Son also brought purification from sin. So he wasn't just a messenger, he was more than that. In his death, he brought salvation to us and purification from sin, which is a necessary part of that. And we also saw the author of Hebrews saying that he stripped himself down to the essentials, the bare minimum, so that he could be born as a man. And so he reduced himself in ways we can't really understand for it to become possible for him to be born as a child and live as a man. And the author told us that the Son was God, and he said he was the creator of everything. He did all of the creating, but he did it according to God's will. And we talked about that last week, how that would have been a familiar thing to the people of that time, because they often had large family businesses where the father of all of the sons would direct all of the sons to do his will and to achieve the goals that he had for the family business. And so that was a natural thing. Of course, there's only one son here, not more than one, but they would get that idea. And also what we saw is that the Son of God is the heir. And that was a position of responsibility and authority on a family business like that. That would mean that he wasn't just like one of the servants. He was a person who had special duties and was trusted specially. He had a cut of the business. And so it was really working for himself is what he was doing in that. So it's not an heir in the sense of you would expect the person to die. We often think of an heir as being somebody who gets something when another person dies, but that's not what's meant by heir here. And an heir in these terms is just a position of responsibility and authority. And so the heirs to the Father had greater authority and greater responsibility. Also, we were told the Son of God maintains all things. So he was not just the creator, he is the one who makes everything continue. Keeps things going on and existing and moving the way he wants them to move. So he does that as well. And then it was said, now the Son sits at the right hand of God. And we talked about what that meant. The right hand of God is the second in command position. He's the person who is the most trusted and the most responsible for doing the work of the person who is the chief, who is the Father. And so a lot of the things that he's using as reference points are things that we aren't so familiar with now because our society isn't built that way. But if you understand those things, it's easier to understand what he's saying here. So summarizing some more, he says the Son is greater than the angels. So he got on this talk about where the angels fit in and where Jesus is relative to them. And he starts out by saying the Son's name is greater than the name of the angels, and it's not even close. He says that God calls him a son, and so you can see that God sees him that way. And the angels worship him. He talked about that as well. And he also says, as we just saw here, God sends angels out to do work. So the angels are the servants of God and Jesus. And so they do the work that the Son is directing them to do. And again, that goes back to the family business, is that the Father would tell the sons and the sons would tell the servants, and they would get the work done that needs to be done. So he also says, God says the Son will have a throne. And so that's a little bit about the future, and we're going to see some more about that coming up today. And that this is a coming kingdom. And finally, he says, as we said earlier, God says that the Son created everything. And he's done this all through pulling out Old Testament verses that maybe people didn't understand until Jesus' time, but are now understood in light of what Jesus said. Okay, so now we're into some really new territory, but in a way we're not. He's still going to be bringing up Old Testament verses to back up everything that he said, but he's going to be talking about some specific areas that are a little different than that. He was kind of focused on where the angels are and showing that the angels were much less than Jesus the Son. And until that time, he's just been calling him the Son. He hasn't called him Jesus. Today we're going to see the first reference to calling him Yeshua. So because of this, we are indebted. Now, because of this is a reference back to the previous verse. It says, because Jesus brought this message to us and was all of this stuff to us, we are indebted that we should be all the more attentive to whatever we have heard, lest we fall. Now, there's quite a bit there, and I'll unpack that for you. I'm going to paraphrase that, first of all, into words that are a little easier for us to understand, I hope. So, because this message was delivered to us by the Son of God, we have a debt to pay. We pay that debt by being even more attentive to that message than we are to the earlier messages. Doing that will keep us from falling away. Now, there's actually a hint in here to the Hebrews, because the Hebrews were struggling and falling away at this period of time. And so they were people who had been brought up, and all of this was explained to them. And we saw the verse last week where the author is sad that they have fallen back to the state where he needs to be going into these very basic ideas about Christianity. But they had been falling away, and so he seems to be suggesting here that if they continue on with the words that they have heard, they will not fall away. And that kind of goes back to the sermon that we had on becoming more spiritual, is that if you keep studying the Word of God and keep building yourself up in it, that will keep you from falling away. And the moment you stop doing that will be when you start to slide back. You're either growing or you're sliding back. So the point about the value of a message is going to be coming up here. And he's going to be saying that the value of a message that you are given depends on who delivers that message. And understand that. And that's true for us too, although we may not have thought of it that way. If your coworker tells you something, that's one thing. Okay? He says, okay, great, I know that now. But if your boss tells you the same thing, that's different. You pay more attention because it was the boss that told you that, even though it was the same thing that you might have been told by somebody else. And that's what's going to be said up here. So just kind of alerting you in advance of what's going to come up here is they're going to be talking about the new law being greater than the old law. And the reason for that is the old law was delivered by angels. Okay, so now you're ready to follow us into the next slide here. So it says, for if a word spoken by angels was established, and everyone who heard it and violated it received a reward by justice. Now that's just the first part of a sentence. And we'll finish that on the next slide. Unfortunately, there's just not enough room to put it all together. And to be honest, the author of Hebrews, one of the reasons to think that it might be Paul is that it has really long run-on sentences, because that's what Paul loves to do as well. But we don't believe it's Paul. It doesn't seem to be his work. In any case, that's off topic. So it starts out by saying a word spoken by angels. Now, this is a reference that you probably wouldn't understand. It's a reference to the Torah, which was delivered to Moses by angels. Now, there's nothing in the Bible that really clearly says that angels delivered that. There's a couple verses that you'd say, yeah, maybe that's what they're saying. But this was something that was believed from the very beginning. There's as soon as we have any recorded history document that talks about how did Moses get the Torah, it always has that idea that it was given to him by angels. And so we see the author of Hebrews also accepting that idea. So we don't really have a good basis for where that idea came from, but it's been existing from early times, long ago. People believed that idea. And so that's what he's saying here. He's when he says, for if a word spoken by angels, he really means for the Torah was given by angels. And that word was spoken to Moses, and it was established as the law for people. So that helps you understand that, I hope. So the author is indicating that the Torah was a lesser law because it was delivered by angels, and that's what I just said. And we're going to see the idea that the new law delivered by Jesus is a greater law because it was delivered by him. And so we could kind of summarize that up again by saying the Torah was delivered by angels, not by God, and it was established as the law. And if those who broke that lesser law got what they deserved, and then that's where we go into the next part of the sentence. And it says, how shall we escape if we despise those things which are our life, those which began to be spoken by our Lord and by those who heard from him among us? So, paraphrasing again, it says, going back to starting with a bit of the previous verse, if they were duly rewarded for breaking that lesser law, how will we escape the reward for breaking the law which was given by our Lord? And so he's talking or making the point about the laws being different. The earlier law given to Moses was a lesser law, and the law given by Jesus is a greater law for us. But they're not really different. The import is I don't want to go into that. But in any case, so he talks about those who heard from him among us. And that's not a well constructed sentence for us to read. What he's doing is he's making a point that some of the people there had heard Jesus speak. Almost certainly they lived in Israel, and so they would have at least heard that there was this person speaking and going around and healing. So some of them at this time would have been people who had actually seen Jesus, but many of them would not have seen him or known anything about him. And so he's making the point that you might not have heard Jesus speak in person, but you have heard from those who did hear him speak. And so he's talking about the apostles and disciples who came afterwards. So this generation is one that is very close to Jesus' time. Some of them, as I said, would have already heard from Jesus as a living person. Others are just hearing him through other people who were there and were with him. So secondhand knowledge at best. We don't even have that. We've got a couple thousand years in between us. And so he's saying that all of these things that you've heard from his disciples and from his words directly from the what if you had heard those words, those things are life to you, and those things are what you need to be focusing on. And again, he talks about those who heard from him, and so that makes us wonder whether the author was a disciple or apostle. It's possible when he says those who heard from him, and he doesn't include himself, that maybe he's saying that he wasn't one of the disciples, wasn't one of the apostles. So we don't know for sure on that one, and that kind of adds part of the mystery to who is the author here. But in any case, moving on. So he's still talking about this new law being greater, and this law being delivered to these people, many of them just through apostles. And he's been talking about these apostles on the last slide. And so he's talking about those apostles were confirmed. And this is what the next part of the sentence is going to talk to us about. It says, while God testified concerning them, the apostles, with signs, wonders, and various miracles, and by gifts of the Spirit of holiness, which were given according to his will. That's another sentence that really needs to be broken down. And I'll paraphrase it a little bit. Those who heard him speak have been confirmed to you by God's testimony about them. That testimony came via the gifts of the Holy Spirit that were given by the will of God. So what he's saying there, the apostles did not do the things that they did. And we know that they did wonders and miracles and all sorts of things. We studied that when we looked at the first church in Jerusalem a few weeks ago. So he's saying that these signs that the apostles did by God are a testimony by God that he has approved of what they were teaching. And so you have that testimony of God through them. And so he has empowered them to do these things, and therefore that shows that he's in favor of what they're saying. So that's his argument there. So he says, therefore these things have God's stamp of approval and are a testimony by him.